God, she reeks of old age. It's the smell of death mixed with mothballs. Those were her words. At her own father's funeral. The heavy scent of lilies and candle wax suddenly felt suffocating, and I watched Father Michael's knuckles turn white as he gripped the lectern. What he said in the next 10 seconds silenced the entire town, and what I discovered later, hidden in an old cedar chest, changed everything. So please, stay with me until the end. Subscribe, leave a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps to know I'm not alone in this. My name is Rosemary Hayes, and I am 78 years old. For most of my life, that number was just a fact, like the color of my eyes or the street I live on here in Savannah. But on the day we buried my Arthur, that number became a weapon. The morning air was thick with the promise of a humid Georgia summer, the kind of air you can wear like a heavy shawl. I sat in my rocking chair on the porch, the wood groaning. A familiar song, but the harmony was gone. Arthur's chair sat empty beside me, still and silent. The azaleas he'd planted were in full, defiant bloom, their vibrant pinks and whites a cruel contrast to the black dress laid out on my bed. The house felt cavernous without him. For 53 years, its sounds were our sounds. The clink of his coffee cup, the rustle of his newspaper, his low hum as he worked in the garden. Now, the silence was an active presence, a guest that had overstayed its welcome. I could still smell him faintly in the closet, a mix of Old Spice and good, clean earth, and I found myself opening the door just to breathe it in, a desperate act of remembrance. My hands, usually busy with a needle and thread, felt useless. My quilts, which told the stories of 100 other lives, had no comfort for my own. My own story felt like it had ended with his. The drive to St. John's Parish was a blur of familiar sights, rendered strange by grief. The ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss looked like weeping widows, their branches bent in sorrow. Every corner held a memory of Arthur, the market where he'd buy me peaches, the bench where we'd sit and watch the ships on the river. I felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were a ghost haunting my own life. The world kept moving. Cars passed, people laughed on the sidewalks, but my own personal world had stopped turning the moment his hand went limp in mine 3 days prior. My daughter, Brenda, was supposed to meet me there. Her text message simply read, "Running late, Atlanta traffic." When I arrived, the church was already filling up with kind, somber faces. Neighbors, friends, people whose wedding quilts I had stitched decades ago. Their hugs were gentle. Their whispers of, "I'm so sorry, Rosemary," were sincere. But their pity felt like a spotlight, exposing the raw, gaping hole in my life. I sat in the front pew, the wood cold and hard against my back, and stared at the polished oak of Arthur's casket. It was adorned with a simple spray of white lilies, and their funereal scent was so overpowering it made my throat tighten. That was the smell I would forever associate with the greatest humiliation of my life. Brenda finally swept in just as the organ began to play, a whirlwind of expensive black silk, and the faint, sharp scent of city perfume that didn't belong here. She didn't hug me. She didn't even meet my eyes. She just slid into the pew beside her husband, a man whose name I could barely remember, and sighed with an impatience that was louder than any word. She fidgeted with her phone, her polished nails clicking against the screen. I tried to focus on the stained glass window, on the image of a shepherd holding a lamb, but all I could feel was the cold chasm that had opened up between my only child and me. I felt a tremor of dread, a familiar tightening in my chest that always preceded Brenda's casual cruelty. It was in the way she looked around the small, humble church, her lip curling slightly. It was in the way she assessed the simple, homespun clothes of our neighbors. She had long ago decided that my life, the life I had built with her father, was a failure. It was too small, too quiet, too Savannah. Her life in Atlanta was the real one, full of important meetings and concrete towers that blocked out the sun. Here, under the dappled light of the oaks, she was merely playing a part. The service began, and Father Michael's voice, usually a warm and comforting baritone, filled the sanctuary. He spoke of Arthur's kindness, his unwavering faith, his love for his garden and his wife. I clutched the worn handkerchief in my hand, my knuckles white, trying to anchor myself to those good memories, trying to build a wall against the wave of grief that threatened to pull me under. I could feel Brenda shifting beside me, a restless energy radiating from her. I didn't dare look. I just prayed she would stay quiet, that she would grant her father this last measure of respect. It was then that I heard the whisper. It wasn't meant for me, but in the heavy silence of the church, it sliced through the air like a shard of glass. She leaned toward her husband, her voice a low, venomous hiss. God, she reeks of old age. It's the smell of death mixed with mothballs. The words hit me with physical force. It wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict. She had stripped away my grief, my dignity, my very humanity, and replaced it with a smell. The smell of decay. I still didn't know that this moment was not the end of my humiliation, but the beginning of a painful revelation. The world seemed to slow down. The scent of the lilies became nauseating. The organ music faded into a dull drone in my ears. I could feel the eyes of the people in the pews behind me, a mixture of shock and pity. My face burned with a shame so profound, it felt like it would incinerate me from the inside out. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had just announced to the world that I was already dead, just a walking corpse polluting the air with the stench of my own obsolescence. And she had done it over the body of the man who had given her everything. For a long moment, there was only a stunned, terrible silence. Even Father Michael paused, his words catching in his throat. He had heard it. Everyone had heard it. Brenda seemed oblivious, or perhaps she just didn't care. She straightened her silk jacket, a small, smug smile playing on her lips. It was in that horrifying moment of silence that I felt the last thread of connection to my daughter's snap. The love I had held for her, a love I thought was unconditional, suddenly felt like a fool's hope. She didn't just resent me, she despised me. Then something shifted. Father Michael, a man I had known my entire life to be gentle and measured, placed his hands flat on the lectern. His face, usually soft with compassion, hardened into something I had never seen before, righteous fury. He looked directly at Brenda, his eyes like chips of granite. The air in the church crackled with tension. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was not the voice of a priest offering comfort, but of a judge delivering a sentence. It was a voice that promised no mercy. "Leave," he said. The word was not a request, it was a command that echoed off the wooden walls. Brenda's smug expression faltered, replaced by disbelief. "You are not welcome in the house of God to dishonor your mother and the memory of a good man." He pointed a trembling but firm finger toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the church. "Get out now." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. No one had ever seen anything like it. This wasn't just a reprimand, it was an excommunication. Brenda's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She shot a look at me, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it took my breath away. It was the look of someone who had been exposed. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. Without another word, she and her silent husband marched down the aisle, the sound of her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the stone floor. The great oak doors slammed shut behind them, and the finality of the sound felt like a tomb ceiling. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer thick with shame, but with a bewildered respect for the priest and a confusing mix of emotions for me. I felt a strange, dizzying sense of validation, as if someone had finally stood up for me after a lifetime of silent endurance. But it was tangled with the deep, aching shame of having my family's brokenness laid bare for the entire town to see. Why had Father Michael been so protective? His fury seemed personal, deeper than just pastoral duty. I remembered Arthur's last weeks. Father Michael had been a frequent visitor, sitting by his bedside for hours. They would speak in low tones, the rumble of their voices a comforting sound from the next room. I had assumed they were discussing scripture, making peace with the end. But now, seeing the fire in the priest's eyes, I wondered what else they had talked about. What had my husband, in his final days, confided in this man? What secret could be so important that it would cause a priest to expel a grieving daughter from her own father's funeral? The rest of the service passed in a haze. I went through the motions, accepting condolences, my hand being squeezed by sympathetic friends, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying that horrible whisper, followed by the priest's thunderous command. The two events were linked, I was sure of it. One was the sickness, the other a strange and violent symptom. Something was deeply wrong, and it was more than just Brenda's cold heart. A seed of suspicion was planted in my mind, a dark and unwelcome weed in the barren garden of my grief. After the burial, back at my empty house, the scent of coffee and baked ham from the neighbors did little to fill the void. Friends milled about, speaking in hushed, respectful tones, but I felt utterly alone. I kept seeing Brenda's face, contorted with rage as she was cast out of the church. The public nature of it all was a deep wound. In a small town like Savannah, a story like that travels faster than fire. By sundown, everyone would know that Rosemary Hayes' daughter was thrown out of her own father's funeral. The shame felt like a permanent stain on our family name. I escaped to my sewing room, the one place that had always been my sanctuary. Spools of thread in every color imaginable lined the walls, and bolts of fabric were stacked neatly in corners. In the center of the room, on a large quilting frame, was the unfinished wedding quilt for my neighbor's granddaughter. But my hands wouldn't cooperate. They trembled as I reached for a needle. The simple act of threading it, a motion I could do in my sleep, seemed impossible. My world had been tilted off its axis, and I no longer knew which way was up. My mind kept circling back to Brenda. Her cruelty wasn't new, but it had always been more subtle before. A backhanded compliment, a sigh of exasperation, a gift of expensive anti-aging cream that was really an insult in a jar. This public display was different. It was a declaration of war. It felt like she was trying to erase me, to sever the final tie now that her father was gone. I was just a loose end, an embarrassing old woman who smelled of mothballs and death. I sank into my chair, the size, familiar floral print fabric offering no comfort. I thought about her childhood, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the shift happened. When did my sweet little girl, the one who would bring me wilting bouquets of dandelions and draw crayon portraits of our family, become this cold, angry stranger? Was it the move to Atlanta? Her high-powered career? Or was the seed of this bitterness planted long before, in a patch of soil I had never thought to examine? The house grew quiet as the last of the guests departed. The sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the living room floor. I was left with the leftover food, the lingering scent of lilies on my black dress, and a silence that was heavier than ever before. The confrontation at the church had not brought closure. It had only opened a Pandora's box of questions. The priest's actions felt like the first chapter of a story I didn't know I was in. I walked through the quiet rooms of my home, my hand trailing along the furniture Arthur had built. Every object held a memory, a piece of our shared life. The rocking chair on the porch, the worn family Bible on the nightstand, and in the corner of our bedroom, the old cedar chest. It had been a wedding gift, and it held the quilts I had made when I was first married, the ones filled with the hopes and dreams of a young woman. I hadn't opened it in 50 years. A sudden, inexplicable urge pulled me toward it. It was as if Arthur himself were whispering in my ear, guiding me. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. A wave of cedar and old cotton filled the air, a scent from a lifetime ago. On top of the neatly folded quilts was something that didn't belong there, a thick, sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Arthur's familiar, shaky hand. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was inside that envelope held the key. It was the secret Arthur had shared with Father Michael. It was the reason for my daughter's bottomless contempt and the priest's shocking intervention. The weight of the envelope felt immense, far heavier than a few sheets of paper. It felt like the weight of the truth. My life had been defined by the stories I stitched into fabric, but I was about to read the one story that had been deliberately kept from me. I was completely trapped, caught between the crushing weight of the past and a future that was now terrifyingly uncertain. My fingers, wrinkled and spotted with age, trembled as they brushed against the brittle paper of the envelope. The cedar chest exhaled the scent of a life I thought I knew, a history preserved in wood and lavender. For a moment, I resisted. Part of me wanted to close the lid, push the chest back into the corner, and pretend this discovery never happened. To open it felt like a betrayal, like eavesdropping on a conversation not meant for my ears. But Arthur's handwriting on the front was a summons, a final request from beyond the grave. The weight of it in my hands was immense, a physical manifestation of the secrets that had poisoned the air at his funeral. I carried the envelope to the small reading chair by the window, my legs unsteady. The setting sun cast long orange fingers of light across the floral print fabric, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence of the house. With a shaky breath, I broke the seal. The sound of the tearing paper was unnaturally loud, a violent rip in the fabric of my grief. Inside, there were several pages, filled with my husband's familiar, slightly slanted script, though it was weaker, more spidery than I remembered. It was the handwriting of a man running out of time. "My dearest Rosie," it began, and a fresh wave of grief washed over me, so potent it nearly buckled me. I could almost hear his voice, that low, gentle rumble that had been the soundtrack to my life for 53 years. "If you are reading this, it means I have failed in my last task, to tell you this myself. I pray you will forgive my cowardice. A man can face his own end with some measure of peace, but telling his wife that the world is not as she believes it to be, that is a different kind of fear. There is no easy way to say this, so I will just say it." I had to stop and press the cool glass of the windowpane against my forehead. My mind was already racing, preparing for a confession of some old mistake, some forgotten debt. But the next sentence knocked the wind from my lungs, leaving me gasping in the empty room. "Brenda is trying to take our home. A month ago, she came to visit not with a casserole, but with a lawyer and a sheaf of legal papers. She wanted me to sign a document granting her power of attorney, claiming I was no longer of sound mind to manage my own affairs. The plan was to have you moved into a managed care facility in Atlanta and sell the house and its contents." The world tilted. The words on the page blurred, then sharpened with a horrifying clarity. It wasn't just a coldness, a resentment. It was a calculated, predatory plan. I tried to make sense of it, to fit this monstrous revelation into the image of the daughter I had raised. I remembered her last visit. She had been unusually interested in the state of the roof, asking pointed questions about property taxes and the upkeep costs. I had mistaken it for a flicker of concern. How foolish I had been. It was an appraisal. She wasn't looking at her childhood home. She was looking at an asset to be liquidated. Arthur's letter continued, detailing his shock and his pain. He had refused, of course. He had thrown the lawyer out and told Brenda never to speak of it again. "She looked at me, Rosie," he wrote, with an expression I had never seen. It was not anger. It was impatience, as if I were an obstacle, a piece of old furniture that refused to be moved. She told me I was being selfish, that I was, letting this rotting old house drain the inheritance that was rightfully hers. She said you couldn't manage on your own, that putting you in a home was the kindest thing to do. The phrase, rotting old house, felt like a physical blow. This house, where every floorboard held a memory, where Arthur had carved our initials into the back of a kitchen cabinet when we were first married, where I had rocked my baby girl to sleep under this very roof. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was the repository of our entire life. To her, it was just a pile of lumber sitting on a valuable piece of Savannah real estate, and I was just the inconvenient, smelly old woman living inside it. Suddenly, the scene at the funeral replayed in my mind, but with a new, sickening soundtrack. Her whisper, "God, she reeks of old age. It's the smell of death mixed with mothballs," was not a random act of cruelty. It was a justification. It was the narrative she was building for herself and for the world. Her mother was incompetent, decaying, better off put away. She needed me to be a senile old woman, so her plan to seize our home would seem like a mercy, not a theft. The humiliation she had inflicted was a tool, a way to publicly declare me unfit. The letter explained everything, including Father Michael's fierce intervention. "I confessed my fears to him, Rosie," Arthur wrote. "I told him what Brenda was planning. I made him promise that if anything happened to me before I could secure things for you, he would protect you. He promised on his mother's grave that he would not let her bully you or dishonor our memory. What you saw in the church today was a good man keeping a sacred promise to a dying friend. He was not just a priest, he was my final line of defense for you." A profound sense of clarity, cold and sharp as ice, cut through the fog of my grief. It was an awakening. For years I had made excuses for Brenda. Her coldness was just stress from her important job. Her condescension was just the way of the modern world. Her lack of affection was just her personality. I had been a fool, weaving a quilt of comforting lies to cover the ugly truth. My daughter did not love me. She saw me as a burden, and our life together as a liability on her balance sheet. The love was gone, replaced by a chilling, pragmatic greed. My first instinct was to crumple the letter, to throw it into the fireplace and pretend I had never read it. The truth was too heavy, too ugly to bear. How could I go on living with this knowledge? It recontextualized every phone call, every visit, every strained holiday dinner for the past decade. It was all a lie, a performance. I felt an overwhelming urge to just give up, to let her have the house, to let her put me away, to simply fade into the mothball-scented oblivion she had already assigned me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was too old and too tired to fight. I sat there for what felt like hours as darkness fell outside, the letter lying limp in my lap. The house was silent, but my mind was a screaming chaos of betrayal and sorrow. I was a quilter. My life's work was to take disparate pieces of fabric, scraps of old dresses, worn-out shirts, baby blankets, and stitch them together into a beautiful, coherent whole. But the story of my own family was a quilt whose seams had been ripped apart, revealing a rotten, ugly batting underneath. There was nothing left to salvage. Then, a flicker of something else sparked within me, buried deep, beneath the layers of grief and shock. It was anger, a cold, quiet, slow-burning rage. It started in my belly and spread through my veins, warming my cold hands. How dare she? How dare she stand over the grave of her father, a man who had given her everything, and plot to discard his wife like a piece of trash? How dare she try to erase the 53 years of love that had been built within these walls? This house was not an asset. It was my home. Arthur's azaleas were still blooming on the IB porch. His favorite rocking chair was still sitting next to mine. His scent still lingered in the closet. This place was the last tangible piece of him I had left on this earth. Selling it wouldn't just be losing a building. It would be like burying him all over again. The thought of Brenda's sterile, minimalist hands packing away my memories into boxes, of strangers walking through these rooms, judging the worn spots on the floor, was unbearable. I looked down at my hands, the hands Brenda found so useless. These hands had raised her, patched her scraped knees, and stitched the quilt that lay on her bed in Atlanta right now. They had held Arthur's hand as he took his last breath. They were not the hands of a weak, incompetent old woman. They were the hands of a survivor. They were the hands of a woman who had built a life with love and hard work, and that life was not for sale. The resistance in my heart began to dissolve, replaced by a steely resolve I hadn't felt in years. Arthur hadn't left me this letter to break my spirit. He had left it as a warning, as a weapon. He was telling me to fight. He was trusting me to protect our legacy, the one thing that mattered more to him than anything. He knew I had the strength, even if I had forgotten it myself. He had always seen the steel spine beneath my soft, quiet exterior. I smoothed the letter out on my lap and continued to the final page. "She doesn't know about the original deed from 1890, Rosie," he wrote. "The one that names the house and the land to the Hayes family line in perpetuity, with a covenant that it can only be passed down, never sold to an outsider as long as a direct heir wishes to live in it. Your great-grandfather was a clever man. I took it from the bank box last month. It's safe. Look in the back of your mother's quilting frame, the one we never use, taped behind the canvas lining. A jolt went through me. The old quilting frame. It had been leaning against the wall in my sewing room for 30 years. A silent monument to a bygone era. It was the perfect hiding place. A piece of my world that Brenda would dismiss as worthless junk, just like she dismissed me. It was a message from Arthur, a plan set in motion. He hadn't just left me a problem, he had left me the solution. He was arming me for the battle he knew was coming. My doubt and despair began to recede, replaced by a clarity of purpose. I was not a victim in this story. I was the guardian of this house, of this family's history. Brenda had misjudged me. She saw an old woman in a rocking chair, smelling of mothballs and death. She failed to see the woman who had weathered storms, raised a child, buried a husband, and stitched 100 stories of love and loss into fabric. She had underestimated the quiet strength of a quilter. I stood up, my joints creaking in protest, but my back was straight. The letter felt different in my hand now. It was no longer a burden of terrible knowledge. It was a battle plan. I walked out of the bedroom and into the hallway, the familiar floorboards groaning under my feet. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like my fortress, my ally. Its silence was not the silence of loss, but the quiet hum of anticipation before a storm. I knew what I had to do. The time for silent grief was over. The time for making excuses, for absorbing quiet cruelties, for hoping for a love that was never going to be returned. That time had ended the moment I read this letter. Arthur had kept his promise to protect me even after his death. Now, it was my turn to keep a promise to him. I would not let our home, our life, our memory be bulldozed by a stranger's greed, even if that stranger was my own daughter. I walked toward my sewing room, not with the shuffling steps of an old woman, but with the determined stride of a soldier marching to the front line. The air was still thick with the funereal scent of lilies, but now another smell mingled with it in my mind. The sharp, clean scent of cedar and old paper. It was the smell of truth. It was the smell of a fight that had just begun. My hand rested on the doorknob of the sewing room. Inside was the quilting frame, and inside that was the key to my future. I was no longer just Rosemary Hayes, the grieving widow. A new role had been thrust upon me. I was the keeper of the deed, the defender of a legacy. I accepted the call. Brenda wanted a war over this house. She had no idea she was about to get one. My sewing room, once a sanctuary of soft fabrics and gentle memories, now felt like an armory. I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years, my steps sure on the creaking floorboards. The old quilting frame leaned against the wall, draped in a dusty sheet, a ghost of projects past. My hands, which had trembled with grief only hours before, were steady as I pulled the sheet away. It smelled of disuse and time, a scent that no longer felt like decay, but like history waiting to be reclaimed. Behind the canvas lining, just as Arthur had written, was a piece of yellowed tape holding a small flat key. It was for the hidden compartment at the bottom of the frame's leg, a secret I never knew existed. The lock turned with a rusty groan, and a small wooden panel slid open. Inside lay the deed, a thick vellum document tied with a faded blue ribbon. It felt ancient, sacred. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. A legal fortress built by my great-grandfather a century ago. A wave of triumph washed over me so potent it made me dizzy. I had it. I had the weapon Arthur had left for me. But as I stood there clutching the document to my chest, a cold wave of reality washed away the warmth of victory. I was a 78-year-old woman holding a piece of paper. What on earth was I supposed to do now? The world of lawyers and legal battles was as foreign to me as the surface of the moon. My first impulse was to retreat. The sheer scale of the fight ahead felt insurmountable. I could almost hear Brenda's voice in my head, mocking my incompetence, calling me a foolish old woman who wouldn't know where to begin. For a moment, the old Rosemary, the one who absorbed insults and retreated into silence, took over. I sat down heavily in my sewing chair, the deed lying in my lap like a dead weight. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach. Maybe I should just give up. Maybe a quiet room in a facility in Atlanta was all I deserved. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying my doubt. But then my eyes landed on the unfinished quilt on the main frame, the one for my neighbor's granddaughter. It was a pattern called the Rocky Road to Kansas, full of difficult angles and sharp points, representing a hard journey to a new life. I had been stitching it for weeks, a testament to perseverance. I couldn't abandon that quilt, and I couldn't abandon this fight. Arthur hadn't saved this deed for me to surrender. He saved it for me to win. I took a deep, shuddering breath and picked up the phone. There was only one person I could trust to help me navigate this rocky road: Father Michael. My hand shook as I dialed, not from weakness, but from the terrifying energy of taking a first definitive step. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and steady. When I explained that I had found a letter from Arthur, he simply said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Rosemary. Don't you worry." His immediate, unquestioning support was the first stone in a new foundation I was building for myself. When he arrived, I didn't offer him tea or cookies. I just laid the deed and Arthur's letter on the dining room table. He read the letter first, his jaw tightening as he did. He looked up at me, his eyes filled not with pity, but with a fierce, protective anger. "Arthur was a good man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And he was a smart one. He knew she wouldn't stop." Father Michael didn't just offer comfort. He offered a plan. He knew a lawyer, a young man from the parish named David Chen, who specialized in estate and elder law. "He's sharp as a tack, but more importantly, he has a good heart," Father Michael assured me. "He'll fight for you, like you're his own grandmother." The next morning, I found myself sitting in a clean, modern office that smelled of coffee and paper, a stark contrast to my world of cedar and lavender. David was young, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He listened without interruption as I told him everything, my voice gaining strength with each word. He examined the deed with a reverence that surprised me, running his fingers over the old script. "This is remarkable, Mrs. Hayes," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's an ironclad covenant. The property cannot be sold out of the family line as long as a direct heir is living in it. You are that heir. The house is yours, unequivocally." Relief flooded my system, so pure and complete that I nearly wept. But David held up a hand, his expression turning serious. "This is our shield, but Brenda can still attack. She'll likely petition the court to have you declared incompetent, arguing that you can't live alone. Our fight isn't about ownership. It's about your autonomy." That was the moment the true battle began. It wasn't just about a house. It was about my mind, my dignity, my right to exist on my own terms. The first letter from Brenda's Atlanta law firm arrived a week later. It was thick, creamy paper filled with words like fiduciary duty, cognitive assessment, and immediate legal recourse. It was designed to terrify me, to make me feel small and overwhelmed. And for a few hours, it worked. The old fear crept back in, whispering that I was out of my depth. I clutched the letter, the paper cold against my skin, and the world felt like it was shrinking again. But this time, I had a new habit. Instead of retreating, I picked up the phone and called David. I read the letter to him, my voice trembling. He let me finish, then calmly translated the legal threats into plain English. "It's a scare tactic, Rosemary," he said. "They're trying to bully you into giving up before the fight even starts. Don't let them. We'll draft a response that shows them we're not backing down." His confidence was contagious. I hung up the phone not feeling scared, but angry. I was no longer a passive recipient of threats. I was a client, a plaintiff, a fighter. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the public library. I checked out books on property rights and elder law. I sat at a brightly lit table and took notes, the scratching of my pen a small act of defiance. The librarian, a woman I'd known for years, looked at me with a new respect. I was no longer just the old woman who borrowed romance novels. I was a student, arming myself with knowledge. Each legal term I learned was another stitch in my armor, another piece of the new quilt I was creating for my life. The external conflicts began to surface in small, insidious ways. My neighbor, Martha, stopped by with a casserole, her face a mask of worried sympathy. "I heard about the trouble with Brenda," she said, her voice low. "Rosemary, dear, maybe you should just make peace. She's your only family. A house isn't worth losing your daughter over." Her words, meant to be kind, felt like a betrayal. She couldn't understand. It wasn't about the house. It was about the dismissal of my entire life. "Thank you for the casserole, Martha," I said, my voice polite but firm. "But this is something I have to do." I closed the door feeling not weaker, but stronger for having defended my position. My old routines began to change. The long, empty hours I used to spend in Arthur's rocking chair, lost in grief, were now filled with purpose. I organized 50 years of financial records, creating a meticulous file system that David praised. I started walking every morning, not just for my health, but to feel the solid ground of Savannah beneath my feet, to remind myself of what I was fighting for. I re-engaged with my quilting circle, not just for the company, but to keep my hands and mind busy, to prove to myself that I was still sharp, still capable. The phone call from Brenda came on a Tuesday morning. I recognized the Atlanta area code and my heart leaped into my throat. I almost didn't answer, but then I remembered David's words, "Don't let her bully you." I picked up the receiver. "Hello, Brenda." Her voice was sickly sweet, dripping with a false concern that was more insulting than her usual coldness. "Mother, I'm so worried about you. I heard you've hired a lawyer. That priest is putting foolish ideas in your head. You're vulnerable right now. Let me help you." The old me would have stammered, would have tried to placate her. The new me took a slow, steadying breath. "I am not vulnerable, Brenda," I said, my voice as calm and even as a perfect stitch. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. I have a good lawyer, and I am following his advice. Do not call me again unless it is through him." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Before she could recover, before she could launch into a tirade, I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. That small act of hanging up the phone was a profound turning point. It was the first time in my life I had set a boundary with my daughter and enforced it. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't cried. I had simply stated my position and ended the conversation. A strange sense of power, quiet and deep, settled over me. I had taken her weapon, her ability to intimidate and belittle me, and rendered it useless. I stood in my hallway, the scent of azaleas drifting in from the porch, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since before Arthur got sick. My journey wasn't a straight line. There were days of crushing doubt, nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I was making a terrible mistake. The ghost of Brenda's whisper in the church, "She reeks of old age," would return, and I would look in the mirror and see only a frail, wrinkled old woman. In those moments, I would pull out Arthur's letter and read it again. I would trace his handwriting with my finger, drawing strength from his love and his foresight. He believed in me, and I was learning to believe in myself. David warned me that Brenda's next move would likely be a formal request for a competency evaluation. The thought was terrifying. The idea of a stranger in a white coat asking me questions, judging my memories, looking for signs of decay, was the ultimate violation. It was Brenda's ultimate weapon, to have the world officially label me as she saw me. To prepare, I started keeping a daily journal, documenting my activities, my conversations, my thoughts. It wasn't just for a potential court case. It was for me. It was proof that my mind was still my own. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old photographs, I found one of Arthur and me from the year we bought the house. We were in our 20s, standing on the porch, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist. We were smiling, our faces full of a fierce, youthful optimism. We looked like we could take on the world. I taped that photo to the wall next to my sewing machine. I wasn't just fighting for the old woman I was now. I was fighting for that young woman, for the life she and that handsome young man had built stitch by stitch, year by year within these walls. The progress was gradual, almost imperceptible day by day. But when I looked back, I could see how far I had come. I was no longer just reacting to Brenda's attacks. I was building my own defense, creating my own strategy. I spoke with David not as a frightened old woman, but as a partner in my own case. I learned to read legal documents, to understand the chess moves of the opposition. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled me. It was now just fuel for the fire. I began working on a new quilt, one unlike any I had ever made before. The colors were bold, deep crimsons, stark blacks, and brilliant golds. The pattern was intricate and sharp, full of jagged lines and defiant starbursts. It wasn't a story of a wedding or a new baby. It was the story of a battle. It was the story of my transformation. Each stitch was an act of rebellion, a declaration that I would not be erased. My hands, the ones Brenda had dismissed, were creating a testament to my own strength. A letter arrived from David's office. It wasn't from Brenda's lawyers this time. It was a formal notification. Brenda had officially petitioned the court. She was requesting a mediation session, the last step before a full-blown hearing to determine my competency and establish her as my legal guardian. This was it, the moment I had been dreading and preparing for. The abstract threat had become a concrete date on a calendar. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the table. I walked out to the front porch and sat in my rocking chair. The humid Savannah air, once oppressive with grief, now felt like a warm embrace. The scent of the azaleas was sweet. The world looked exactly the same as it had a month ago on the morning of Arthur's funeral. The house was the same. The street was the same. The ancient oaks were the same. But I was not. I looked over at Arthur's empty chair, and for the first time, I didn't feel a pang of loss. I felt a sense of partnership. "Well, Arthur," I whispered to the empty space beside me. "Here we go." There was no panic in my chest, no cold dread. Instead, there was a quiet, unshakable calm. I thought of the woman who had sat in that church pew, shattered by a cruel whisper, feeling her life was over. That woman was gone. She had been stitched over, patched up, and reinforced with stronger thread. The grief was still a part of my fabric, but it was no longer the whole pattern. It was now just one color among many, among anger and resolve and a strength I never knew I possessed. Brenda thought she was fighting a frail old woman who smelled of mothballs. She was about to find out she was fighting the matriarch of the Hayes family, and the matriarch was not giving up her home. The mediation office was a world away from my own. It was a place of cold glass, steel furniture, and air so chilled it felt artificial, designed to keep emotions at a manageable temperature. Across the polished mahogany table sat Brenda, her face a carefully constructed mask of concerned daughterhood. Beside her, a lawyer with a shark smile and a $3,000 suit shuffled papers with an air of practiced boredom. He saw me as a simple procedure, a box to be ticked. I sat straight in my chair, my hands resting calmly on my purse, and met his gaze. The woman who had crumbled in a church pew was not in this room today. Her lawyer began, his voice smooth and patronizing. He spoke of my advancing years, my understandable grief, and the complexities of modern property management. He painted a picture of a fragile, confused old woman who needed protection from herself, a woman lost in a world she no longer understood. Brenda nodded along, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek for the mediator's benefit. I watched the performance with a strange sense of detachment, as if viewing a poorly acted play. The words that once would have shattered me now felt like pebbles thrown against a stone wall. When he finished, David simply slid the vellum deed across the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This," he said, his voice calm and clear, "is the original 1890 deed to the Hayes family home, containing a perpetuity covenant. The property cannot be sold so long as a direct heir, in this case, my client, Mrs. Rosemary Hayes, wishes to reside there. It is legally untouchable." The shark's smile faltered. He picked up the document as if it might bite him, his eyes scanning the faded ink, his professional composure cracking with every word he read. A thick, heavy silence descended upon the room. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. Brenda's lawyer cleared his throat, his face flushing. He looked at Brenda, a flicker of accusation in his eyes. She had clearly omitted this crucial detail. Brenda's mask of sorrow finally shattered, replaced by a raw, ugly fury. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "She can't live there alone. It's not safe. She's senile." The final, desperate accusation hung in the sterile air, stripped of all its power. The mediator, a kind-faced woman who had been watching me intently, turned in her chair. "Mrs. Hayes," she said gently, "would you like to respond?" All eyes were on me. This was the moment. I took a slow, steady breath, the air feeling clean and full in my lungs. Looked directly at my daughter, not with hatred, but with a profound and sorrowful clarity. I was not speaking to a lawyer or a mediator. I was speaking to the ghost of the little girl I had once loved more than life itself. "The house is not the issue, Brenda," I said, and my voice did not tremble. It was as steady as the stitches on my finest quilt. "This was never about the house. This was about you needing me to be small so you could feel big. You needed me to be weak so you could feel strong. You needed me to smell of death so you could feel alive." I let the words settle, each one a carefully placed stitch in the final pattern of our relationship. I was no longer defending myself. I was simply stating the truth. I continued, my gaze unwavering. "Your father built that house with his own 2 hands. I made it a home with mine. It is not an asset. It is not an inheritance. It is a testament to a life you have chosen to despise. You will not erase it, and you will not erase me." I said nothing more. I didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and it filled the room with an undeniable weight, leaving no space for lies or legal maneuvering. My conquest was not in the deed, but in that moment of speaking my own worth into existence. The mediation ended 20 minutes later. There was nothing left to discuss. Brenda and her lawyer left first, a whirlwind of frustrated whispers and the sharp click of her heels on the tile floor. She didn't look at me. I walked out of that cold building and into the warm, humid embrace of a Savannah afternoon. The sun felt glorious on my face. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and the nearby river, had never smelled so sweet. I had walked into that office as a defendant. I walked out as the victor. My transformation was complete, but it wasn't loud or explosive. It was a quiet, internal shift. The old Rosemary would have gone home and wept, either in sorrow or relief. The new Rosemary walked to the market and bought a bag of fresh peaches, the kind Arthur had loved. I went home, sat on my porch, and ate one, the sweet juice running down my chin. I wasn't just occupying the house. I was living in it, fully and completely, on my own terms. The silence of the home was no longer a void of loss, but a peaceful space of my own making. The news of my victory traveled through the town in the quiet way that small-town news does. It wasn't gossip. It was a legend. Martha, my neighbor, came over the next day, not with a casserole of pity, but with a bottle of her best Scuppernong wine. "I was wrong, Rosemary," she said, looking at me with a new admiration. "I am so proud of you." We sat on the porch and shared the wine, and for the first time in a long time, I laughed until tears streamed down my face. They were not tears of grief. Father Michael stopped by that evening. He didn't say much. He just stood on the porch, looking at the azaleas, which were in full, glorious bloom. "Arthur would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. In that moment, I felt my husband's presence more strongly than I had since his death. We had done it. Together, we had protected our legacy. His promise, and now mine, had been kept. I spent the next few days in my sewing room, not out of obligation, but out of joy. I finished the battle quilt. It was a masterpiece of crimson and gold, a map of my journey from the depths of grief to the summit of self-possession. Every sharp angle represented a harsh word. Every golden starburst a moment of clarity. I hung it on the main wall of my living room, replacing an old, faded landscape. It was a declaration. This house was not a museum of the past. It was the home of a vibrant, living woman. I look at my hands now, the ones Brenda dismissed as old and useless. They are wrinkled, yes, and the joints ache on rainy days, but they are not weak. These hands held the pen that signed legal documents. These hands dialed the phone to ask for help. These hands stitched a story of resilience into fabric. They are the hands of a woman who fought for her life, not with a sword, but with a needle and thread, and with a truth that refused to be silenced. The woman who sat in that church, drowning in shame, feels like a distant ancestor. I remember her pain, but it no longer defines me. Grief is a part of my story, a deep, indigo thread woven through the fabric of my life. But it is not the whole. Quilt. My quilt is also woven with threads of courage I didn't know I had, of friendships that held me up, and of a love for my husband that proved strong enough to reach beyond the grave and arm me for battle. I think about Brenda sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a sad, detached pity. She lives in a world of glass and steel, chasing a success that will never fill the void in her heart. She traded a home for a house, a mother for an asset. She will have her inheritance of money one day, but she has lost the inheritance that truly matters. The stories, the memories, and the unconditional love that were sown into the very foundations of this place. My life is quiet now, but it is not small. It is rich and full. My days are filled with the familiar rhythms I once took for granted. The groan of the rocking chair, the scent of baking biscuits, the feel of cool cotton under my needle. But I experience them differently now. They are not the routines of an old woman waiting for the end. They are the deliberate choices of a woman who has earned the right to her own peace, in her own home. People in town look at me differently. They see me not as the poor widow Hayes, but as Rosemary Hayes, the woman who stood up for herself. The young women in my quilting circle ask me for advice, not just about stitching, but about life. They see a strength in me that I never saw in myself until I was forced to. I have become, in my own small way, a keeper of more than just quilts. I am a keeper of the knowledge that it is never too late to find your voice. I often sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance under the Spanish moss. I look at Arthur's empty chair, and I no longer feel the sharp pang of his absence. Instead, I feel the steady warmth of his presence. I talk to him, telling him about my day, about the new quilt I'm planning. And I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that he hears me. My journey began in the deepest darkness, in a moment of public humiliation designed to erase me. But it did not end there. It led me down a rocky road I never would have chosen, but one that ultimately brought me back to myself. I learned that a person's worth is not determined by their age or by the opinion of those who refuse to see them. It is something you claim for yourself. I had to lose everything to realize what I truly had. I had to be told I was worthless to finally understand my own value. My story is not about a house or a legal battle. It is about the quiet dignity that resides in every human heart, waiting for a reason to fight. It's about the strength that can be found in the gentlest of souls when they are pushed too far. The world may see an old woman in a rocking chair, surrounded by the relics of a bygone era. They might smell mothballs and time, but they are wrong. What they see is a survivor. What they see is a queen on her throne. And what they smell is not the scent of death. It is the sweet, triumphant fragrance of azaleas in full bloom, a testament to a life that refused to be uprooted. This house is my kingdom, and my quilts are my history. I am the storyteller, the guardian, and the matriarch. My hands may be old, but they are still creating, still stitching, still holding on. I have learned that the final chapter of your story is not written by your children, or by society, or by the passage of time. It is written by you, and you alone decide when it is finished. My needle is still sharp, my thread is still strong, and my story is far from over. I am Rosemary Hayes, and I am home. This is the message I want to leave with you. Never let anyone convince you that your story is finished. Pick up your own needle, choose your own thread, and stitch a new ending. You have more strength in your hands than you could ever possibly imagine.